Hearing crickets in your business when you've been putting in so much time and effort can be very disheartening. And what do you do with that? Do you pivot? Do you change? Or do you just stay the course and see what God is going to do? That's what we're going to dive into in today's episode. And we're going to look at what Scripture has to say about it and change our perspective around these seasons of waiting. So stick around. If you're feeling God call you to pivot life as you know it by leaving your career plans to start an online business, and you're terrified of how you'd ever actually pull that off, then you're a mama with a calling, and this is the podcast for you. Here's where we'll talk about everything from choosing the right business and running it as a mom to biblical inspiration and motivation to conquer your fears. Because even though it's causing you some anxiety, you're also excited because you know God's calling you to it. And that means you're headed to a life with more joy, fulfillment, and purpose like you've always wanted. Hi, I'm Alexia Carrillo, fellow mama with a calling, and I'm passionate about helping other moms like you step into their calling and not stay stuck in their career for fear of going against the grain. I believe it's okay to pivot and follow God's calling on your life without the guilt or shame for not doing what the world says you should do. This is the Mama with the Calling podcast, where we'll figure out how you can actually make this wild calling on your life become a reality. Let's grab some coffee and dive in. Hey there, and welcome back to the Mama with the Calling podcast. Before we get into today's episode, I want to ask you a question. Do you ever feel like you're doing everything right when it comes to following the calling that God has given you? You've become an entrepreneur, or at least started down that path, but you're just not seeing the results that you thought you'd see by now, and the journey is much harder than you ever envisioned. Well, it turns out that there are two things that could be getting in the way of your success, and they aren't super obvious either. They are, one, going at this whole entrepreneurship thing alone, and two, operating from the old ways of thinking about what success really means. And this is things about money, knowledge, you and your abilities, hard work, etc. Now, we both know that you're serious about being home with your kids and doing what God has called you to do. You want to have a bigger impact. You want to have freedom financially and with your time. I mean, why else would you be listening to this podcast, right? Which is why you should keep an eye out for my Black Friday offer announcement on November 15th. It's going to make pursuing your calling, achieving success with your business, and truly enjoying your journey of entrepreneurship go so much easier and strengthen your faith along the way. This is going to come in an email on November 15th, and I'll say it on the podcast as well that week, whatever the episode is that week. But if you can't wait for the announcement, then I want to invite you to join my VIP, very interested and important person, wait list for Black Friday. So not only will you hear about it early, but there are also chances to get in on fast action bonuses if you're on the wait list. So to do that, go to mamawithacalling.com/Black Friday, and you can get on the list there. So I just wanted to get that said first. And for today's episode, I want to start with a question. So do you ever wonder if anyone is listening? Is anyone really affected by the work that you're doing? It can feel really frustrating to keep putting all of the effort into your business, yet feel like you're talking into the abyss, right? If you just knew that someone was out there being affected or impacted by your work, by your words, by anything, then it feels like it would make the journey so much easier, right? You'd happily create content and products to serve people if you had some sense of certainty that they were actually on the other side listening to your content or wanting your products. But what about when you're not seeing that? Does that mean that you should give up or that you're doing something wrong? In this episode, I want to talk about how to handle this as an entrepreneur and how to reframe it as a Christian entrepreneur doing this business for God. Because if it's not for God, then why are we doing this, right? This is something that God has put on your heart, and it's to honor Him and glorify Him in what you're doing. So that means that we are called to do business differently. We're called to think of things differently. And this is where there's a business side to things, and then there's a faith side to things. So we'll talk about both of those in this episode. So first I want to say this is a common thought at the beginning of your business, especially because you're just getting started and you're trying to gain that traction. So this is the part of your journey where you are finding your voice, as they say. You're getting more and more comfortable with sharing the message that God gave you, and you're creating content to get the message out there. And that's all great. And you start out all excited for the potential. Not only have you seen how others share and so many people respond and resonate, but you're just as excited to share this message that God has put on your heart because you see that, wow, like I'm so excited about this. I can start sharing about it and other people are going to respond to the message that I have. So you start sharing, you start podcasting, blogging, whatever it is, but you don't see much interest, or at least it doesn't appear that way. You might have a few likes here or there, some traffic to your blog, a handful of listeners to your podcast. And at first you tell yourself, okay, it just takes time. You're going to stick it out and you're going to keep putting up that content, and eventually people are going to come. But after like a month or two, you're not seeing any changes. And this is the point where you start to really ask yourself if this is worth it. Is this even working? Maybe nobody cares about what I'm saying after all. This is where all those doubts and worries will surface. The imposter syndrome, the fear of failure, doubt on God's call on your life in the first place, doubting the business direction. All of that stuff will start to really bubble up in this phase. And what can happen is you start to seek more knowledge. If you can just figure out the strategy, then things will change. So you take courses and try different things and try to learn, and you change your business direction. You stop putting out content as much because you are learning, and you start trying different kinds of content. Maybe you're like, no, I'm going to try YouTube, not podcasting. No, Instagram is the thing. Like you're going to keep kind of bouncing around, trying different things, trying different social media strategies and styles. And this is what happens to so many entrepreneurs, myself included. And I hear it from clients all the time as well. They come to me wanting to know if they're on the right track. Should they pivot? What are they doing wrong? And a lot of times this is because this phase is just hard. It just is. It's hard to wait. And I am just now, honestly, really learning how to do this, how to have faith and how to go through a process where it's not instant gratification, where we might have to do things that take a while to show the return. I think of the analogy all throughout the Bible of planting and sowing, harvesting, all of that, because when you plant seeds today, do you get a plant tomorrow? Or in a few minutes, even in a month, maybe not. And there's a lot of work that goes into actually growing the plant, all of that, right? And then you have to actually harvest. All of that work is still an act, like you're doing work, but God provides the harvest. He allows the growth, right? He prevents the pestilence from coming or whatever. Like all of those things together bring the harvest. So it's hard though. You have to have a thing of faith, an act of faith to be able to do that. So these are the 3 things that I tell people when they come to me with this. And I want you to think about these 3 things that will help you overcome these negative thoughts that come up when you're in this period of pushing through, even though you're not seeing any results. So the first thing to remember is everything takes time, and waiting is actually part of the journey. So we want instant validation for efforts, right? It's hard to wait and see what happens. This period of waiting requires a lot of faith on our part. Logic will try to talk us out of it. How can you keep doing something when you clearly have data saying it's not working, right? You don't have data saying that it is working. You don't have any data, or your data is nothing. So therefore it means like I'm putting in this effort and I'm not making money. But in the world of online marketing, it actually can take 3 months or more to see the effects of the marketing you do today. Now, there are obviously times when you can do something today and somebody just kind of, they say yes. And you might feel like that's a quick win. And maybe God does give you that quick win. But for the most part, in general, it can take 3 months to see the effects of the marketing that you do today. There are a lot of people out there with a lot of things to say, and you have to learn, number 1, how to even share your message, what your message is, how to share it, how to keep sharing your message enough so that you get found and noticed by the people that need what you have to offer. You also have the algorithms of Google or social media or, the podcasting or any of that. You have all of those things. Think about a great speaker that you've heard, or even a great quote from someone online that came up on your feed somewhere. At that moment, you might be like, wow, that's great. That's amazing. I love what they're saying. but then you move on, right? If you never see anything else by them, then they're just forgotten. It was great content, and it doesn't mean that you don't love what they're saying, but it's forgotten because maybe you're doing something else. Maybe you're in a mode where you're just scrolling through social media versus looking for information. Or maybe you were just busy, or your kid got in the way and, distracted you, or whatever. And so if you never hear from them again, they're just forgotten. But if you dive into their content, or unless you see it again and again and again and hear them over and over and over, then you start to realize, oh, I'm building a connection with them. I resonate with their message. I am now like a student or a follower of them, right? Because you're sort of saying, I like what they're saying. I want to learn from them. I want to do it their way. So thinking about this in your own business, if you show up on social media for a week, but then bail because no one's paying attention, you're not really giving it a chance, right? Or let's say podcasting or blogging. Let's say you put up a couple of podcasts and you're not getting very many listens, or you put up a blog and a month in you have no traffic and you just quit. Well, you're not really giving it a chance. And in addition to all of the marketing stuff taking time, God often has us go through seasons of waiting for a reason. It's in these seasons that he tests us, he refines us, and gives us the chance to increase our faith and trust in him. I think of Moses as he went to Pharaoh and asked the first time for him to let his people go, and Pharaoh said no. Then he increased the workload of the Israelites, and they got mad at Moses. You can read about this in Exodus 5, but Moses basically goes to God and says, God, what are you doing? Why did you do this? You told me that you were going to let your people go, and you haven't done it at all. You're not rescuing them like you said you would. And Moses really wanted that quick solution. It was already a huge act of faith for him to go back to Egypt in the first place. So the first hurdle he comes across that doesn't work out like this, and he has the opposite of what he expected, he goes to God with it. And I think that's great. I mean, I'm not saying that it's, bad that Moses did that. You should turn to God and say, what is going on? Because Moses wanted that quick solution, and he was already pushed way out of his comfort zone, leaving his simple, quiet life as a shepherd in the wilderness. He did this thing that God asked, and it didn't happen instantly. He got upset, and he went to God, and this is what's so interesting. So think about this. What would have happened if God had listened and had freed his people the first time? Would they have been able to really trust Moses to lead them? Would they have had the faith in God's power and love for them? He's getting ready to do the 10 plagues. Would they have seen all of that? Would they have believed that he was bigger, more powerful, and stronger than the Egyptians, the people that had ruled over them for all these years? That was their power. Even though they did believe in God, but you can see in this story that they fuss at Moses because they're not hearing that Moses is with God. They're hearing that the Egyptians are mad at them, that the Pharaoh is mad at them, and they have more work. They're not focused on, but God sent Moses. So, and the other part of this is, would they have even really left the comfort of their homes in Egypt and gone into the unknown, into the wilderness? Like, do you want to have a home, or do you want to go out into the wilderness and the unknown? So even though it didn't look like God was doing anything or what Moses wanted him to do, he definitely was, right? He had a plan, and the perfect one at that. So Moses had to learn to wait, and him coming to God with it to hear God's response was getting that affirmation. So I just want to point that out, that we should definitely be praying through these seasons of waiting. That is how you're going to build a relationship with God. You're going to hear from him. You're going to get that affirmation to keep going. You need that. And as Moses learned to wait, he was learning to trust, and he could see the power and faithfulness of God. And I imagine that brought him even closer to God and increased his faith in God too. So waiting when you think it's not working or you're not getting anywhere is actually part of your journey and necessary for you to access the other side, like the result that God's taking you to. So that's the first one, that waiting is important. The second thing to remember is with God, you can't possibly know all the ways in which he's using you. So just because you don't see it or don't hear people tell you that they're affected doesn't mean it isn't happening. I think about how much you can be impacted at church or at a conference. Just because you didn't tell the speaker how much of an impact it made on you doesn't mean it didn't have one, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't go up to the pastor every week and tell him exactly how it impacted me. This week, I was reminded of this when a woman in the Mama with a Calling Facebook group told me that she had received affirmation about something that she felt God was calling her to do in her business. And in that moment, she told me that she had heard something on the podcast that actually affirmed that for her. And in that moment, I was just overwhelmed with this gratitude and joy and this amazement how God can use something that just seemed so simple to me, and how God works all things together. And it's this intricate connection that we can't even understand. I mean, there are so many steps involved. I had to hear from God, and then I had to actually take the action and record the podcast. And then on her end, God was speaking to her, and she had to listen. She had to receive that and actually listen to the podcast, right? And actually hear the first part of what God had told her, to even hear it as an affirmation. And all of that together, she was able to get confirmation for what she wanted to do in her business, and she's doing it. That's amazing. That's exactly what I'm hoping for when I do this podcast, that it speaks to you and encourages you, draws you closer to God on your entrepreneurship journey. But it also occurred to me that I would have never known that unless she told me. But me knowing it doesn't really matter, right? That's like a little gift from God. But it doesn't matter whether she told me or not. It still happened. So you don't know the impact of anything you're doing. Just because you can't see it or even know about it doesn't mean that it isn't happening. So this is another way that God asks you to have faith, that he will use and is using everything he asks you to do. Okay, so the third thing is that the ultimate goal is actually to serve God and not people. This one might be a little harder to hear, but it's important. I want you to ask yourself why you think you need to know that people are being impacted. So a lot of times we will tell ourselves that we really care about helping people. So we want to make sure that we really are. And that's obviously true. Like, we do want to help people and we care about that. But this can open the door to people pleasing or seeking the approval of people and others instead of God. Especially if you're already struggling with people pleasing like I have, then it can definitely be a dangerous place to be in. So if you're basing your actions on the approval or validation of others, then you're going to drive yourself crazy trying to find the thing that's going to get the validation that you're seeking. So putting out all sorts of content, trying different things, and then getting really discouraged really quickly if you aren't seeing the response from people that you want. Like I mentioned before, you don't know what's actually happening on the other side, but it wouldn't happen at all for sure if you gave up and didn't create it at all, right? And this is also how people end up getting all wrapped up in the success or fame of the online space. You've seen people do that. They start out really modest and then they get to, their head gets really big because of all the people that are following them and talking to them. And it can start out so little, like just wanting to check your analytics and see if people are responding. But when they do, you risk using that validation as affirmation of your worth and your value. So you want more and more recognition and accolades, and you take pride in the number of followers and subscribers, etc. Not because they represent people that you've helped or reached, but it morphs into people that like me or people that follow me or people that approve of me. See what I mean? So what does this mean for how we should change our heart when creating content and looking at sales and things in our business? Because, like I was saying in the beginning, this is a business. So in a business, like, you have to make sales. If it's not making sales, then it's not doing very well. And you definitely need to be thinking about product sales and things, because that's how you will make money, right? But it's about the heart. It's always about the heart and why you are doing what you're doing. In 2 Timothy 2:4, it says, "No one serving as a soldier gets entangled in the concerns of civilian life. He seeks to please the commanding officer." And Colossians 3:23 says, "Whatever you do, do it from the heart as something done for the Lord and not for people." So if we are concerned with what God has asked us to do, then it doesn't matter how many people like, share, or comment. That's not the reason you created the content in the first place. You're really doing it in obedience to what God wants you to do. So if people aren't responding the way you want, that's actually not your focus. So you're going to keep going. Do you see the connection I'm saying here? Like, if you're focused on God asked me to do this, I'm going to step out in obedience and I'm going to do it, then you're going to keep moving, listening for God to tell you otherwise. And even if you're not making money, or even if you're not having the sales rack in, or even if you're not having a million people like your stuff, you're still going to move because God's asking you. But, don't get this all twisted. I'm not saying that your content isn't created for people. I mean, it is, but it's those likes, that affirmation. I know there's tons of times when I scroll through social media, I don't actually like or comment, but it still impacts me, right? People listen to this podcast. I don't know if they're impacted. I hear from some, but I'm sure there are lots of you that are really impacted by some of the episodes and maybe not others, but I have no clue. My reason for creating it isn't to hear back from people. It's because I just trust and have faith that God's going to do something with it. And I don't know what that is, right? I'm stepping out in faith. So your reason for creating your content and doing this business isn't to get people to say they like you, or even to tell you that their lives have been changed, or even that you helped them so much. While those are great things, your goal, your only reason is that God told you to, and you're going to step out in obedience and do that. Like with this podcast, I'm creating this episode right now because God put it on my heart to share it. I don't filter it as, what if nobody cares about this? Or will this make me money? Or is this searchable? Now, I will say at first, that was one of my struggles. I found myself in this spiral of, wow, the podcast is impacting people, so I need to make sure the next one's going to really make an impact. But I was getting stuck because I don't know if it's going to make an impact. And I had to really work through doing what God's asking me to do, the end. And I don't know what he's going to do with it. I don't know when, I don't know when it's going to happen. But all I know is that I'm going to do it, because I have no idea how many people are going to listen to it, or if only one person listens to it. I don't know how many will be impacted. Most people aren't going to tell me, but it doesn't mean that God can't or won't use what I'm saying. And in the same way, you never know how God is going to use your content, products, etc. And you never know when. You could put up a podcast today and people could be impacted by it today, or it could be months or even years from now. You could create a product and nobody buys it, not a soul, but it's there because God is bringing you somebody that is going to need it that day, and you need to have it ready. And that's what matters. It's going to be ready because you had obedience the first time he told you to do it. I think of Christine Kane in this example because she wrote a book called How Did I Get Here? And it came out in 2020, but that's not when she wrote it. She wrote it before that, right? The idea was well before that. And I remember hearing that story and I thought, how amazing, because she was just being obedient and writing her book. She didn't know how many people would really need that book with that title in 2020. How in the world did I get here? She couldn't have even seen that coming, right? But God knew. So stepping out in obedience, even if you don't know what it's going to do, right? So with all this said, I know it's hard to keep going and putting time and effort into your business when you aren't even sure if it's working. But remember these 3 things before you give up or change course. Number 1, everything takes time, and waiting is often part of God's process with us. Number 2, you have no idea how God is going to use your content, products, etc. And number 3, check your heart and make sure that you're doing all things for God and not for the approval of people. And keeping these things in mind, you can overcome any doubt or worry that comes up for you. If you find yourself stressing over your business not working, and then come back to these 3 and check your thoughts and your heart, you're going to be able to use these and know that you're walking in obedience when God asks you to do things, and not letting fear and doubt and worry sidetrack you. You're trusting that he's going to use it in whatever way he sees fit, and knowing that you're pleasing him by your obedience is really the ultimate reward anyway. And like I said, if this is a business, so along that journey, at some point, there is a chance where it's like, what am I doing wrong? Do I need to learn something? And that's where, if you're continuing to bring this back to God, he will put that on your heart. Like, something's just not right. Or the people that you think you're talking to still isn't quite right. And that's possible. But as far as just giving up entirely and just, not doing this business, we have to give it time and keep these 3 things in mind. So I hope this encourages you this week. And as always, keep pursuing your calling. Thanks for listening to the Mama with a Calling podcast. As always, you'll find the show notes for today's episode at mamawithacalling.com/podcast. Really quick before you head out, Are you loving these episodes? To make sure this podcast gets in the ears of as many mamas as possible, please head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. I'm going to be reading your reviews on the podcast, so I can't wait to hear from you. Also, if you know someone that needs to hear these episodes, grab a screenshot and share it on Instagram, and don't forget to tag me at Mama with a Calling so I can share it in my stories. Until next time, keep pursuing your calling.